Okay, hello. Today we have a panel of science policy experts who will be talking about their career trajectories through the policy field. They're working across different organizations and types of sectors like government, nonprofit, and industry. And they'll share with us some of their advice and strategies on how to navigate from a bench science career to a career in science policy. So I'd like to also note that there are resources and more information on science policy careers and fellowships in the Career Symposium program book. So if any of you are interested in learning more about this field, please make sure to check that out. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Sophia Hupalo. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the NIH, and I'll be moderating the panel and asking our expert speakers questions on behalf of NIH trainees. So our speakers today are Andrew Robertson. He's the global head of strategy, digital, and data sciences at Sanofi. Sarah Rhodes, who's a health science policy analyst in the Office of Evaluation, Performance, and Reporting at the NIH. Tyrone Spady, who's the Director of Science Policy Coordination, Collaboration, and Reporting Division within the NIH. Sylvie Raver, who's the Associate Director at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy in the Milken Institute. And Andrew Merluzzi, who is a program officer at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So welcome, and thanks again for volunteering your time to be here. I would like to start off by asking you what piques your interest in science policy, and why do you think that particular interest is important? So let's start off with Andrew Merluzzi, since you're first on my screen.
Sure, that sounds good. So I first became interested in science policy. I was writing for a kind of a general readership magazine right after I graduated college, and I had an editor who was kind enough to allow me to write about more or less whatever I thought was interesting. And it ended up being, I attended conferences at NIH or National Academy of Sciences on behavioral science and psychological research, and tried to figure out how that research might impact policymaking. This was right around the time that the Obama administration was standing up sort of a behavioral insights team and thinking about how psychological research could be used in policymaking. So it sort of started there, and then I guess just generally, my graduate degree is sort of a bit in science and technology policy, and so really from that time, it's just been an exercise in thinking about if we're making decisions as a society and we're making decisions about government, we should at least make sure those decisions are informed by the best available evidence.
Thank you. Sylvie?
A very similar answer to Andrew's there, especially at the end, making decisions informed by evidence and best available research out there. I got interested in what I understood to be science policy when I was a postdoc fellow at the NIH. But I think even before then, I was really more drawn to the implications of the research that I was doing than the nitty gritty of the research I was doing in the lab itself. I just really wanted to think of the broader societal implications of the work that I and others were doing. And I realized that was pretty much what science policy broadly means. And I would say that I plug into it a little bit more on the policy of science as it relates to scientific funding. So I kind of think of it as two ways, science to inform policy and then policy to inform how science is conducted. So I'm sort of on the second wave of that a little bit.
Thank you. Tyrone? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Echoing what folks have said before me, I started out as a graduate student assuming that my ultimate career would involve some sort of interaction with the policy space. I didn't have a well-articulated vision of what that would look like or that people did it as a full-time vocation. So it was wonderful to be an NIH postdoc and realize that there are professionals doing science policy work both in the government and outside the government, that you could do this as a full-time job.
Thank you. Sarah?
So unlike Tyrone, I, as a grad student, had no idea what science policy was. I moved over here in 2007 to do a postdoc at NIH, was on the, professor career trajectory. And at that point, there was just the build up for the presidential elections, and everyone was getting all excited in DC about the opportunity and how it might impact science, and science policy kept coming up in conversation. So that's when I first started hearing it and started having discussions about it with different people. I went to a lot of OITE events like this. And it was one of those events that the flashbulb sort of went off in my head, and I decided that I was listening to somebody and wanted their job, because I'd always liked the bigger picture of science, which again feeds into what everyone else has said. And that's when I started to pursue the idea that maybe I was interested in something else even more than I was interested in bench science, and did a detail which confirmed it, and decided to make the move.
Thanks. And I'd love to talk more later about what a detail is for those who might not know. Andrew Robertson.
Thanks. Thanks for the invite, for being here. So for me is very similar, I think, to a lot of the other folks. I actually started going in, again, on the academic track. I was, at one point, I think I wrote my third grant in a month, and I thought, well, eventually I'm going to be away from the bench one way or the other. I loved doing bench research, but I kind of figured that, the more you advance, the less research you actually get to do. And so at the same time, because of the way my graduate program and my postdoc program was structured, we had a lot of interdisciplinary interaction. So like, it wasn't just biologists with biologists, but we were talking with historians and philosophers and government majors. And that really kind of got me interested, not only in the science, but what's the broader context in which the science is conducted. And I guess on the same time, what could I actually bring to those bigger conversations, given the experience and the background that I have.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like each of you, one thing you have all in common is that there's sort of an appreciation of sort of going beyond maybe in your scientific training what your project is really investigating, and expressing more of an interest in going beyond that and the implications that might have on policy making, society, health. So I want to maybe now delve into a little bit more of the specifics. So if you could talk about what you do in your position, and specifically, as we've kind of alluded to, the fact that science policy is a very sort of nebulous concept, and it can refer to a lot of different things. So I'd like to ask you, what does science policy mean in your world? And what is it really that you do on a daily basis in terms of your job responsibilities? So we can start with Andrew Malusi again.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I really like Sylvie's description. I think it's used kind of a lot in terms of thinking about science for policy, or policy for science. What I do at National Academies, and I think what National Academies does as a whole, is really science for policy. So it's policy using evidence, policy, using good ideas, not necessarily about the scientific enterprise. So I guess in some sense, my day to day it's a lot of research. It's more or less like doing a lit review all the time on various topics, and then like writing chapters, writing books about those ideas. That's sort of like when you're at your desk, that's what you're doing. But in addition, it's a lot of conversations, right? So I'm not, let's say, for instance, if I'm working on a project related to opioids, I'm not an expert in opioids. I have a background in neuroscience. It's not really related, but I have to quickly become an expert on that. And part of that exercise is doing a lot of the independent research, but it's also talking to the experts. And so National Academy is sort of like the blue ribbon work that we do are these consensus reports. And that's where we bring in experts really from all throughout the US and all throughout the world who know a lot about a particular topic. And we facilitate discussions with them. We find out creative ways to get their expertise into the reports that we're writing, really for the US government. And so it's a lot of interesting conversations, and it's a lot of independent work, writing and editing and reading.
Sylvie?
Very, very similar actually to what Andrew does. This is a nice segue, and I would add that the skills are really similar. A lot of writing, a lot of reading, a lot of identifying who the right people are, knowing that you're not always the expert in what you're doing. You got to find who those people are, and then ask them really important questions and synthesize what they say into some sort of consensus. Even if you're in a field or a topic that hasn't necessarily reached consensus, you got to kind of find the common threads. And then distill it out for whatever your audience is. And whereas Andrew's audience or the National Academy's audience, like you said, are more government entities, what I'm doing at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, which is within the Milken Institute, our audience is philanthropists, so individuals or foundations that have a lot of capital, philanthropic capital, and they want to put it towards advancing health solutions. So I work on the biomedical team. Milken Institute in general is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And so more of a think tank kind of structure for most of the centers, which is going to be more towards policy, science for policy, like the first kind of bucket that we talked about. Whereas I'm more on the side of the institute that identifies where funds need to go, where there are gaps, where there are problems in medical research issues, and identify where philanthropic capital can plug in and really make a transformative change. I'm also only a month into the job, so I'm still learning. I came out of a scientific society before this, where I was a staff for 4.5 years, so I'm still figuring it all out.
Sarah and Tyrone, since you're both at the NIH, maybe somewhat similar but slightly different capacities, I was hoping if you could touch on what it is that you do and sort of highlight maybe the differences between your job responsibilities and roles. Sarah?
So using the science for policy and policy for science definition, I'd say, Sylvie and Andrew said they do a lot of the science for policy. At NIH, we do some of that. Obviously, we're an agency of experts, but a lot of what we tend to do in the policy arena at NIH is policy for science. So policy for the conduct of science, making sure that science is done in the best way. And so all of the jobs that I've had at NIH, I would say I do that. In terms of my specific job, so our office, the mission of our office is to capture, communicate, and enhance the value of NIH's biomedical research. And that we do that through sort of tightening up the stewardship pipeline, so strategic planning, performance, evaluation, and reporting. I'm more on the strategic planning side of things. I lead that for the office, and strategic planning or priority setting is one of the linchpins of policy for science. I would say in terms of the skill sets, a lot of what we do is the same. So, we do a lot of convening committees. So there's a lot of sort of collaboration, coordinating, teamwork going on there. There's a lot of reading, there's a lot of writing, a lot of communication in general, both written and verbal. Again, a lot of analysis. So bringing in your skills that you honed without realizing it through your scientific training. And again, we're all juggling things at the same time, so a lot of flexibility in that. I'm sure I've missed out a few.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess that leaves me. So I actually work in the office that Sarah used to work in. So we're a lot closer in terms of our than maybe some of the other folks. So essentially, my job falls into two buckets. One is external engagements, and the second is coordination activities. In terms of external engagements, our division works on sort of managing NIH interactions with regard to the Foundation for NIH, the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program, our National Academies contract. So all of the studies and NAS-related activities that NIH supports that come through that contract are routed through my division. And we also handle our interactions with the General Accountability Office and the Office of the Inspector General. So um, those types of activities. In terms of the coordination aspects, we are sort of the principal points for our the Office of Science Policies interactions with the congressional communications related activities, and also we try to position ourselves as sort of the face of the policy space in the for the Office of Science Policy across the NIH. So NIH has all these institutes and centers, each of which constitute policy functions in radically different ways. If you've seen one institute or office, you've seen one institute or office. So we try to work with and figure out ways to make all of those divergent pieces parts um, uh, coordinate a little more effectively with one another. And prior to my work at NIH, I actually was in the nonprofit sector for 9 years, doing projects and work that was very similar to some of the things that others have discussed, sort of serving as a liaison between Congress and policymakers and our scientific experts in the academic community. So, yeah, a lot of communications, a lot of project management, um, yeah, those sorts of activities.
Thank you. And Andrew Robertson.
Thanks. So I'm in my current job for about 3 months right now. So I'm the head of strategy for digital and data science at Sanofi, which is one of these major pharmaceutical companies. Before I get to that, I'll talk about my former job because I think it's actually a lot more relevant to this discussion. So for past 4 years, I was the head of regulatory science and policy for Sanofi, and then prior to that, I was doing a similar job in Merck. And I think that what everybody else has talked about science for policy and policy for science is really similar to what we did, but we had a different framing of it, which is in layman's terms, inside out, outside in. So in one context, you have FDA and the regulatory authorities that honestly the FDA is probably one of the most influential regulatory bodies in the world. Not many people know this, but like 25 cents out of every dollar spent in the U.S. is regulated by the FDA, and they actually a lot of what the other regulatory groups do, they look to the FDA. But the trick is that the way that they actually approach science and demonstrating drug efficacy and safety, that's always evolving. There's going to be new data sources, new priorities, looking at patient information, rare diseases, that kind of stuff. But as they're evolving the way they're thinking, industry is a key partner here, and so they don't want to do it in isolation. If they were to go in and say, tomorrow this is what everybody's going to do, they come out, industry might say, well, we can't do that, and then all of a sudden the whole relationship breaks down. So the inside out is basically taking our own internal experts and making sure that they are plugged in to the FDA, and that we actually facilitate that conversation. We issue spot, we show what's the priority for us, and we actually articulate a position, just like what everybody else has said so far. The other side is the outside in, which is, okay, with all that in mind, the FDA still is going to be moving forward. Typically, we look at things like guidance or precedent for drug approvals, but there's a big gray zone there. So for a policy perspective, what we do is we look at it and we try to interpret those trends and those the trajectory that the agency might go, and help that inform our strategy. So will they be more willing to accept a certain data source? Will we have a better chance if it's a rare disease or in oncology, which is a really hot topic? So that's the outside in. So that was my previous job. Now I'm taking all that skill set, and actually now my current job, what we're doing is looking at digital technology. So I'm very much more focused on a specific areas like digital health. So things like wearables, artificial intelligence, large data sets. How can we actually integrate those into the drug development pipeline? But there's still policy there, like data governance, data privacy, data usage agreements, funding, um, uh, all the elements we just talked about. So taking what I did before, which is I was much more of a generalist. I had my areas of expertise, but as a generalist, I'm trying to refocus that specifically on what I think is a really interesting topic, which is digital and health.
Thank you. So one common thread that I'm sensing here is that you, in all of your positions, you do a lot of sort of kind of meta-analysis level reading and trying to synthesize a lot of information sometimes scientific, and a lot of times sort of translating that to make it accessible to a really public audience. So your communication skills, written and verbal, have to be very strong, as well as your ability to navigate multiple projects at once, and be able to sort of be flexible in managing multiple things in those tasks. All of these things seem like things that scientists in their scientific training learn, maybe sometimes in different amounts. So I was wondering whether we could next talk about sort of, in addition to having your scientific degree and training background, what are some experiences and training that you had coming out of your PhD or maybe law school, that you kind of used to leverage your skill set for a policy position? And if you could speak about it in a way that sort of taking the skills maybe you had kind of that you developed in the lab and maybe elsewhere, and how you translated them. And if there are skill sets that you didn't have coming out of your PhD, maybe what kind of extracurricular activities you participated in that allowed you to be able to claim that as a skill set. In order to help people who are maybe NIH trainees who are interested in transitioning to a similar type of job in terms of helping them what they could do to better prepare for this career. Sorry, that was a long question. Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in there. So I guess for me, certainly a lot of the skills that I gained in getting a PhD are relevant more or less everywhere. And I think it is just a function of how to figure out how to talk about them. So, project management is one obvious example. What is a PhD other than a set of projects over time, right? Varying in degree and length and all of that, but it's figuring out, how to meet deadlines, how to collaborate with a team on something, how to find the information you need quickly and be able to utilize that information quickly, become an expert in a new technique or something like that. All of those things are really relevant to my current field, and I would argue just kind of relevant in general to work. So I guess those are the kinds of skills that more or less anybody picking up a scientific degree is going to get, and it's just figuring out how to translate them. I think another thing, and this is sort of in the skills bucket, but maybe a little bit more in the experiences bucket. One thing I've noticed is that, certainly in national academies and other places that are sort of more like think tanks and science policy organizations, they're just going to value experience, right? So they're going to look at a couple of different candidates. Anyone who's got anything approaching sort of a science policy internship or an advocacy type organization, if they know something about how the government works, for instance, that is just going to go a really long way. And obviously, it's way easier said than done to find like a foot in the door. But I guess that would be sort of my biggest piece of advice.
Mm-hmm. And Andrew, you did a fellowship during your PhD, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the National Academy of Sciences has it's called the Christine Mirzayance Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. That's just one of many. Institute for Defense Analysis, IDA, has something similar. AAAS has something similar. These are all pretty competitive programs, but they're excellent programs. I think even more generally than that, and they're also sort of on awkward time schedules. So if you graduate and it doesn't line up, that's totally understandable. But I think maybe even more generally than that, even in a more unstructured way, finding, a place where you could do some volunteer work. Maybe Society for Neuroscience has something like this where they would need some help with their sort of outreach strategy or something like that. Just anything where you can get a little bit of exposure to something, maybe on the state level or on the federal level, that is just a little bit closer to the policymaking process.
Are we going in the same order?
Sure.
Let's jump in next. So much of that echoes with me, and I'll add on a little bit of specifics about how I took exactly Andrew's advice when I was a postdoc, and I just started volunteering for things. I didn't have anything structured at first, but I started seeing some calls. I started paying more attention to all those emails that you get when you're an NIH fellow across the listserv, because OITE is an incredible resource of information to sort of like clearinghouse it to you. You just have to read the emails. And so I started doing that a little bit more, and volunteering and I just started applying for things. I was like, what's the harm in doing this? And it helped me focus, articulating my skills, practice writing applications, practice writing for different audiences, whether it was a tiny blurb or like a full-fledged application. You just have to start doing it and like pull the Band-Aid off. So I started doing that, and I volunteered with, I got elected to a fellows position for the fellows committee. I started volunteering with the National Postdoc Association and starting kind of understanding what some of the policies affecting postdocs and postdoctoral training, and then bigger picture scientific training issues were. And I just kind of kept layering on experiences and then finally showing the impact of those experiences. So one thing that I've seen is really critical in putting together job applications or resumes, or even talking to people about what you're doing, is demonstrating the impact of your activities. So not just being on a committee, but really showing what you've done in your work for that committee. So I was exactly looking at some of those fellowships, the Mirzayance one and the AAAS one, and it wasn't lining up with my timing, but I'd gotten my foot in the door through volunteering with the Society for Neuroscience that I was a member of, and I had this laundry list of volunteer activities and all of these things that I'd done with it in a really concentrated about year of my postdoc. I did a really quick postdoc and made myself competitive to be hired by the Society for Neurosciences at a manager position, and then brought all of that training experience and my time in the lab into the society and served as a liaison between staff and the members, of which I used to be one, and I've now got back to being. So it's sort of this liaison role that Tyrone mentioned earlier that I think scientists are really able to fill.
Yeah, I was wondering, Sarah and Tyrone, you were, I think, both also NIH postdocs. So could you talk a little bit about maybe your activities as a postdoc that you participated in that maybe are specific to NIH trainees? And then also, Tyrone, maybe you could also talk a little bit more about the AAAS fellowship, like who's eligible and like who shouldn't apply and who should apply. Or who it's more suited for, and maybe who it isn't, based on your experience with that.
Do you want me to go first? Do you want to go first?
You can go first, sure.
Well, let me just quickly go back to the original question. Just what we had in our scientific training, what skills were sort of transferable. So I'm going to echo everybody else. Project management, you don't realize how good a project manager you are, both in terms of having very long-term projects and short-term projects. I mean, your scientific training, you got that down. Same thing with collaboration. You're collaborating with a whole load of different people in the scientific arena, and not always the easiest people to work with. And so again, that's a really good skill you build up. Scientific literacy, just being able to pick up something sciencey, and it might not be in your area, but you can probably pretty much figure out the general gist of what's going on. Again, you've built that up without realizing it. And then again, your analytical ability, your analytical mind. It's just the way that you kind of look at things and analyze them. So analyzing data, we're always analyzing data, we're analyzing policy, things like that. Those are the things that you're bringing with you. In terms of the holes that I realized I had when I wanted to make the transition, I would say direct experience. So it's always easier to get a job if you have some sort of direct experience, and I know it can be tough. I know Tyrone will talk a little bit more about the fellowships. I was not eligible for fellowships because I was not a citizen at that time. So I was lucky enough to be able to go the detail route, as Sophia had mentioned before. So that's if you're an NIH trainee, you can ask to be positioned in a different office. You have to set it up yourself. It could be for different amounts of time, different timetables. So you could be doing a full-time detail for a month, or a half-time detail for 6 months, whatever you can work out and get your supervisor to agree to, and find an office that's willing to host you. That I did, and that really got my foot in the door. I'd also say volunteering outside NIH. I volunteered for several different areas. So I volunteered for a science policy advocacy group, Institute on Science for Global Policy. So I got that really good global science policy perspective. I also did a lot of volunteering for AWIS, Association for Women in Science. And that was really, really, really helpful, again, to get different angles of policy experience. I would say get committee experience. So this is something, again, NIH is wonderful with. So I was on FELCOM, so the Fellows Committee, and also I was on several policy type committees. So I was the postdoc rep on the working group for women in biomedical careers, which is an NIH wide committee, and you get to interact with the policymakers, the true NIH leadership. Communication, you're used to writing papers for scientific audiences. You need to be able to communicate to different levels, whether it's Congress, the general public, other scientists. Again, you can get a lot of experience. I got a lot of experience at NIH. I wrote for the NIH Catalyst, which I would highly recommend for everybody. Try and get a variety of different topics to write about, not just your own scientific talk. I also wrote for AWIS, the AWIS magazine, and I wrote and edited the newsletter for AWIS. And then finally, something long term that could show you're really interested in science policy and that you have some sort of build up of knowledge. So again, if you can't do a fellowship, do some courses. I did several courses, a AAAS course. I had a fellowship, NSF, UPenn fellowship on neuroscience and society. I did a Georgetown course as well. And again, to show your interest, join the policy cafes. NIH has a really good science policy discussion group. I was one of the founding members of that, and that was really great because you got to discuss really cool different topics on science policy, and organize seminars, invite experts, and dip into various different topics, and also network with people who are interested as well. Over to you, Tyrone.
I think that's your last point is what I would say probably the most important aspect of all of this is networking, talking to your colleagues in the lab and outside about what you're interested in. That for me provides a variety of opportunities. One, it makes you more facile and fluent in articulating what your interests are. It also helps to expand sort of the sort of collective knowledge that you have access to in terms of figuring out opportunities, figuring out organizations that are doing things that you're interested in. So yeah, talk to people about what you're interested in. You never know who can help you and who you might be in a position to help. So my three general pieces of advice would be getting out of the lab just to get a sense of what sort of the lay of the land is. I don't even think it necessarily has to be in the science policy space. I think having experience dealing with bureaucracies, whether they be government or otherwise, are a tremendous experience in the policy space. I think hopefully that helps you get a sense of whether or not that pace, that style of work is something that's of interest to you. And then I think it's really doing the soul searching to think, okay, what am I passionate about? What is interesting? Do I really care about basic research? Do I really care about human subjects protections in clinical research? Do I really care about health disparities? Finding that angle, it doesn't necessarily mean that has to be the thing that you work on for the entirety of your career, but as a sort of toehold, I think it gives you a certain authority, even if you don't have the professional experience, to be able to go in with a legitimate passion and an interest in something. And finally, I would say it's really important to focus. So after you've done the work of figuring out where your interests lie, not being afraid to lean into that. I think sometimes when folks are transitioning into science policy, there's a tendency to feel like you have to be a generalist and take or seek any opportunity that is out there. I think it and unfortunately makes you expend a lot of effort on things that may not necessarily be optimally suited for your interests. So if you are fortunate enough to know what you want to do, then I say try to focus in those areas. In terms of my specific experience, the first thing I did as a postdoc at NIH was to organize an intramural staff art show. So nothing really to do with science policy, but it was a wonderful experience, sort of figuring out um, how to navigate the NIH bureaucracy to reserve space, to get permission to do things in the clinical center, to figure out who's in charge of gallery spaces in the building. All not deep policy issues, but the experience of um, having to figure all that out was great. I loved it. And I just also happened to work on the first, I think it was the first Career Symposium, um, as an organizer of one of the science policy sections. So then I was sort of moving more in the direction of policy. And finally, once I figured out exactly where I wanted to be, my passion was basic research. Um, this was around the time of the Obama administration. Obama had just come into power, and Tom Daschle had been nominated to be the secretary of HHS. And Dr. Collins was the presumptive um, it was presumed that he would become the NIH director. And then Tom Daschle's nomination fell through. And Francis happened to be in his office, was across from our lunchroom. So I took the opportunity to network uh, and talk to him about what my interests were and what he viewed as sort of uh, useful places to focus. And he was very generous with his time and did an e-introduction to the folks at the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. And that led to a short-term part-time detail. So you can do details both inside and outside of government if you have the support of your PI. So all those I thought were helpful experiences that led me toward my first position at FASEP. So yeah, I didn't burn down the place. So I was ultimately hired on to stay. In terms of, I think so. My story, I hope, demonstrates a few things. One, fellowships are great. They're amazing. You particularly if you're a part of AAAS or the Mirzayance Fellowship Program, you come in with a cohort of professionals, like-minded professionals that become your colleagues for life, both in your agency or in your organization and outside. So it's nice to be a part of that and to get the information exchange and the professional development stuff. But um, that's not the only way to go. And if people feel like they don't have access to those fellowships for a variety of reasons, you're international, um, you can't translocate to the Washington D.C. area. There's still tons of stuff that you can do in terms of, I think someone mentioned engaging with local government, engaging with the university. Many universities have congressional relations departments. There you go. In addition to doing other types of activities um, to again get that experience outside of the lab. But in terms of the AAAS fellowship, yes, it's a great program. Um, I'm going to invite you to go to the website just so I don't spend too much time on it. But you can Google AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. But that program is only available to people who are U.S. citizens, and you also have to have a PhD. So a PhD or an equivalent degree. I'm sorry. So those do represent significant restrictions, but there are by no means barriers to entry in the scientific policy space.
And it sounds like a detail is another way to maybe get some of that really specific experience if you're not potentially eligible for one of the fellowships. Andrew Robertson, I was going to ask, without maybe repeating some of what the other speakers have said, what are there any differences in what a qualified applicant interested in doing policy in the industry field might want to have in terms of experience?
So industries is interesting. So I was actually a AAAS fellow. That's how actually I got transitioned over. And then for some bizarre reason, I went back to law school, and then so I got that kind of dual perspective. But I think it kind of plays into to everything, right? And so without repeating, but maybe slightly reframing what you guys have said, when we hire I've gone through a lot of hiring processes and looked at a lot of candidates. I guess I look for really two things, which is either experience or achievement. So experience being, if you do something, if you work with somebody particular, if you actually you gain experience even without trying, just by doing something for like 5 years versus 10 years, right? We assume that there's a level of competence there and a level of knowledge and understanding. Um, you know, just because you've been somewhere for 10 years doesn't always mean that you know everything, but it's one thing, right? It's part of the narrative. Then the second thing is about achievement. Like, okay, so what you've done, like if you were to put a pin in, had you not been somewhere, this would not have happened. I think is really useful because it kind of helps orient people. When we review applications, there's a lot of talent out there, and it's not to say not to discourage anybody, but a lot of folks that on paper seem really good, but they might, either you can't really describe them in a couple of sentences. And I think it's just like there's a human behavioral aspect to when we're looking at candidates to say, oh, this is the person that really understands patient experience data, or this is the person that really understands distributed clinical trials. And so I would say part of that narrative, part of that experience is if you were to come out of this and say, my story is whatever it is, I think it really helps. Me personally, part of my narrative is that I did the PhD, then I went to government, then I went to law school. So I've got kind of a very breadth of experience or perspectives. That's what's kicked me off. But then as the year progressed, that wasn't going to carry me forward in my career. So I had to actually become an expert in something, God forbid. So so then I actually had to refine myself a little bit more. And now, if you were to ask me, I would say, real world evidence is one of the things that I was really took the company forward. Now it's going to be digital health and digital science. I think that really helps in making yourself competitive for some of these positions.
Thank you. Just keeping an eye on the time, one question, and then maybe our last question, but one question that I do want to get to is you all are in the policy field in the greater Washington, D.C. area. What types of job opportunities are there in science policy outside of this region? Maybe, a lot of NIH trainees move outside of the region after they are done with their postdoc. And so what opportunities do they have available to them, both in terms of organizations or, I think one answer that has already been mentioned to this question is, state and local government. But, besides that, what kind of organizations or job positions would be available? Thank you.
I can jump in real quick. I'm probably not the best qualified to answer this, but I know from being in policy school in Wisconsin and being in the Capitol in Madison, certainly tons of my colleagues, even colleagues who didn't end up with a PhD, but were interested in kind of health and human services, maybe science policy in some capacity, or environmental policy, or something like that. There's certainly no shortage of state government organizations who deal with that sort of thing. I mean, this is sort of the magic of living in a federalist country. So, health and human services is a place where, I might be qualified to work at the federal level. But every state has a very similar organization that does kind of the health research in the state, the service delivery in the state. Those are all organizations that would really value technical expertise from someone who might have an interest or a background in biology or biological sciences.
And I think Andrew would be an example of people who go into industry. There are pharmaceutical companies, there are biotech companies, there are all kinds of digital product companies all over the place. They're obviously going to be, some of them are going to be clustered in the hubs, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, but those aren't necessarily DC. Universities, almost all of them are going to have government relations or places. I think don't discount the fact of what we're all doing right now, which is virtually working. Not all of these jobs where you don't need to be at a bench. You can do a lot with working remotely, so some of them will not be tethered to a physical location.
Yeah, I mean, I can add in really quickly from just to cap off the private sector perspective that you're absolutely right. Like, so, a lot of, for when I was doing science policy in my previous position, a lot of my counterparts, their companies might be based in Chicago or Indianapolis. and they come to DC a lot. But like I said, there's two prongs to this job. One is taking your expertise and your ability to develop consensus and influencing policy. The other is taking the policies as they're emerging and actually taking them back to whoever your stakeholder might be. I did work at a law firm for a bit, and that was a big part where our clients were actually looking at saying, this government just said this. What does that mean? Are we going to lose a contract? And we need to understand that. And then, but having said that, I think that if you want to be an influencer of policy at the federal level, DC is going to be where a lot of it happens. Except for, again, what Sylvie was saying, the real big innovation hubs like Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, San Diego to some extent, Austin as well, where going in there, and if a big company wants to do something, if a Google or if a large with a large Boston biotech wants to do something, they would actually get the government people to go to them. That's pretty cool. That's a nice amount of power that you influence might have. But those types of positions exist as well, and you want to have your stakeholders or your senior leadership of your company ready for that conversation, and that's what your job would be.
Just jumping in there, I think someone had also mentioned earlier, so I'll just re-mention it, that most of the universities or academic institutions will have government relations officers. And a lot of those positions, yes, they are in DC because they want to be in DC to influence things, but you do also have people back in the institution as well. The other thing I was going to mention is that not all government jobs are in DC, or government policy jobs are in DC. So just take NIH, for example. NIEHS is based down in the Research Triangle, and so a lot of their policy people are down there. So we work with them via WebEx and so forth. CDC is down there too. I also know a lot of people who will start their career here and then will move somewhere else for various different family reasons. Once you've built up your relationship at NIH or within a specific office, and built up your network and built up people's your relationship with people, it is often possible to move to a purely teleworking role. Doesn't tend to happen straight away, but it does tend to happen to people who have been working for a few years in the government and then have to move away. So that's another alternative.
And my sort of thought is that people shouldn't feel bounded by their academic experience. So my background is in evolutionary biology and genetics. My first job was very much squarely in the sort of basic life sciences space, so focused on NSF and NIH advocacy and policy work. My next job focused on USDA, DOE, and the Department of Energy, mainly in the food and ag space. So, a whole different set of stakeholders, whole different set of agencies, whole different set of opportunities. The regional hotspots for those areas are a little bit different than for the biomedical research area, for biomedical research companies. So they tend to be focused more in the middle of the country. For example, NIFA recently, for example, moved to I believe it's Kansas City, which has a number of food and ag research related companies. So yeah, I would say, don't feel limited. Don't feel limited in any sense, really. Yeah, your imagination is the limit to what you can do.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we're running out of time, but I kind of wanted to give any of you the opportunity to maybe, if there's anything else that we haven't mentioned yet, for NIH trainees who are interested in science policy, we have just a couple of minutes left.
Sure. I have one thought. This has come up maybe tangentially, but just to put a finer point on it. I think the value of just setting up informational interviews, getting coffee with somebody you think is doing interesting work, that cannot be overstated. I was certainly doing that as I was looking for jobs, and the 2 job offers I got out of graduate school were because I knew somebody or I knew somebody that knew somebody. And that's crucial. And even now, every once in a while I'll get an email from from a trainee at NIH who wants to talk about, what is science policy like? Certainly all the people that are going to be watching this video are already sort of on the right path in that capacity, but just sitting down for half an hour with somebody, having them look over a resume, is this the sort of resume that would work in your organization, that would get some traction? I think that's really, really useful.
And I should mention that the OITE has a whole PDF online on how to conduct an informational interview and what kinds of things to ask. So for anyone who's interested, who's watching this, not you all.
And to Andrew's point, I would also say try not to be intimidated by people who you feel are more senior. You have to be willing to talk to anybody, both sort of laterally and horizontally in this business.
That's a great point. And I also think everybody here is an example that no job is forever, and careers are winding, and you can do all kinds of different things in different organizations. So if you're not where you want to, the last question, if you're not where you want to geographically be forever right now, think of everything as a stepping stone, and every experience really builds on the next one.
Yeah, I'll add one more too, which is in the spirit of networking, the way that you interact with people, I think, is actually critical. We've heard this term, this is a buzzword, emotional intelligence. It kind of gets, it's huge, because if people if they're a little bit discouraged from working with you, you're not going to be as effective in the job. So people, I mean, there's a way to do it. There's not a formula to do it, but you have to find it. And it's funny. Some of the most prominent scientists I've seen, they think they can walk into policy, but just because nobody really likes working with them, and so it's a little bit tricky to kind of get along with them. So I'll just throw that one out there, that the way that you actually interact and emotional intelligence and presentation skills are actually really important.
I would just iterate everything that everyone said as well. We haven't talked about networking a lot, but that's, I think, probably how we all got our jobs. Certainly how I got all of my jobs, and my detail. And I would just say, again, it's that emotional intelligence that sets people apart, scientists and science policy people apart. It's being able to sort of work the room, work people, sort of, conduct yourself well, collaborate well. And again, going into informational interviews, everybody hates them. They're never comfortable. You might have to be persistent. People in policy are very busy. They might not reply to your first email, and that doesn't mean that they're not interested in talking to you. Most people are always keen to talk to people. Everyone loves talking about themselves. They might just need to be reminded gently again. They'll often reply a second time. When you go into an informational interview, don't go in asking for something other than their time. Just focus on hearing about their story, what they do, their advice for you. Don't go in there. It's very easy to tell if someone's just looking for a detail or a job, and that just puts your guard up. Just focus on building that relationship, getting that information, stay in touch with the person. If you build up a good relationship with them, and they have a good the feeling about you and confidence in you, if a job or a detail comes around later and you still stayed in touch, they're going to think of you. NIH is especially, I'm sure this is the same in the policy world in general, is a very, very tight-knit community, and word travels fast about good people and bad people, for want of another word. And so your reputation, you will start building up a reputation, and it will precede you. And so, you will find that you build off this reputation, whether it's for good or for bad. So again, just it's all about networking and all about relationships and all about hard work and persistence. And start now. If you're interested, start now.
Okay, I find that to be an inspiring place to end the conversation. No, I mean, really, I think we've kind of covered a lot of ground today, and we've talked a lot about ways that folks can sort of get involved and follow their interests within the NIH or outside. So yeah, with that, I guess looks like our time is up. So I, again, want to thank you all for volunteering your time today to help us out and share your information about your career trajectory. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.